Welcome back to my studio. My name is Monica, and today we're going to talk about watercolor mistakes. And these are typically beginner mistakes that people often make with watercolor, and then they're completely turned off with the process of painting. And I think that going over some of these mistakes, I don't want to say that it will prevent you from making them, but I think that you will figure out a time and a place to use these kind of mistakes, if you will. And I don't really think that there are any mistakes, because you can learn a ton from making mistakes. That's the best way to learn. And a lot of times, if I'm painting something and I make a mistake, actually learning how to correct a mistake or make it part of the painting somehow is just another creative problem solving process. So these are not bad things, but I just want you to be aware of these when you're painting, and how you can use these issues or mistakes to your advantage, really. So the first one I want to talk about is using too much water. And if let's say I'm going to paint a sky and I've got this puddle of blue mixed up, and I have a ton of water in my puddle, and I've got a ton of water in my brush, and I go in here to start painting a sky, I'm going to have a really watery, diluted sky, which may cause some puddling, and it may get a little bit difficult to control. And I wouldn't do something like this. I would want a little bit more pigment in my puddle than this, because it's going to dry lighter anyway. But using too much water will just give you uncontrollable results. Now, using too much water can also kind of be a fun thing to do if you're playing, or depending on what exactly you're painting. It's really great to be able to drop in colors when you have a lot of water on your paper and let them mix and do their thing. You can get some really, really great results, spontaneous results from doing something like this. And this just takes a little bit of practice. I have done many mixed media pieces, and I've done paintings where I've used this really wet type of background, and I would even spray this to create intentional runs and drips and things like that. So I don't think they're necessarily mistakes that we're going to be talking about here. Um, it's just an appropriate time to use certain things on certain pieces in your painting. So the second mistake that most beginners make are using too little water. And I know that it takes a little bit of getting used to load a brush with a puddle of water and not wiping this off. But watercolor brushes are designed to hold a lot of water. And if you dry your brush off, or you go into your pan and pick up pigment with not a lot of water, you are going to get a dry brush kind of effect like this. And it's really hard to fill in a space when you have no water on your brush. But like I said, it's all relative. So it really depends on what you're painting. If you are, let's say, you're painting a tree, this would make really great texture for some tree bark. And just going to pick up a little bit of brown, and I'll show you kind of, what that would look like. If I went down, move that out of the way, I am just using a brush that doesn't have a lot of water and I'm barely touching the surface, and I can add a little bit of an edge here, right? So there's an appropriate time to use this kind of method, but if you're filling in shapes and you're trying to blend colors, you want water on your brush. And this is a super effective way of creating textures. Just lightly dragging your brush across the paper, and you can practice all of this. These are make a whole bunch of trees. And if you wanted to, go a little bit darker, so you can create like a whole forest full of trees. These would make really great birch trees. So you get the idea. And this is great for using over areas of grass. If you've painted a solid green, then you can go over it with a dry brush technique like that and create some texture. I even think I've got too much water in my brush. You can go over an area of color and create some texture to indicate some grass or things that are growing. So it has its place. It just really depends on what you're doing. But for the most part, when you're painting, you want to make sure that you have a puddle and you're loading up your brush so that you can paint a shape. You can always pick up another color and continue your shape. So the next mistake that a lot of people make are not letting their layers dry. If you are creating a wash, and let's say that we are painting a sky, and I'm going to pick up some paint and I'm going to paint a sky. And on top of this sky, I want to paint some mountains. Well, if I go in with some paint right now, and I'm going to just pick up a random color, I'll pick up some of this brown and get a puddle going here. So if I go in here and try to drop these mountains in before I let this layer dry, you can see what's happening. These mountains are going to be completely lost. It's going to be really light. The edges are not going to be crisp, and we won't know what that is. It will just look like a big blob of paint. But this also has its kind of time and place where you want to use it. If I want to paint a sky, we'll go in and do our sky again. If I want to paint a sky, and then I want to create some trees that are in the background, but I want them to be very far away from the viewer, and I want them to also be a little bit blurry, then that is when I would like to go in and add these tree shapes while this is still wet. And I want to wait probably a couple of seconds. I don't want it to be super wet and puddling, but I still want it to be damp enough that when I go in here and lay these trees in, I don't have to do any work to try to diffuse these shapes and make them look like they're in the distance. Because the watercolor paper is still damp, it's going to do that for me. And it's really just a question of timing. And the more you paint and the more you get used to the environment that you're painting in, and that didn't even really blur out the way that I wanted because this dried so quickly. So I'm going to actually show that to you again. And this is, you know, part of learning about the environment that you're painting in. My watercolor dries really, really quick. It's very warm in my studio, and I have to kind of blow air in here from another room to get it to cool down a little bit. Um, so I always have like a dry condition, and things they dry really quick. So I'm going to go back in here with my sky again, and I'm going to show you those trees. And because I know that these are going to diffuse, I can grab a dark color. I can grab a lot of pigment on my brush. I don't want a really watery mixture. And if I were to have a watery mixture, I'm going to show you what that would look like. And pick up some water. If I went in with a lot of water, it would just be um, uncontrollable. So you want to make sure that you have, a little bit of water on your brush, but mostly pigment. When your background is wet, if you want to create a diffused kind of a look. See if I can just go right on top of this. And so in a case like this, not letting your layers dry is to your benefit. And um, you can work with these different types of mistakes to your advantage. Um, they're useful. All of these mistakes are actually quite useful in creating watercolor paintings. And if my layers are dry, obviously I can go right back on top of the dry, and I can paint in, whatever I want because the watercolor underneath is dry. And this won't move and my edges will stay nice and sharp. So something like this, I would let dry completely, and then I would add in another layer of trees. And I think I'm going to show you that just because it's fun. So I'm going to give this a quick dry. Okay. So now we could go on top of this and add in some trees that were more defined and more saturated in color. And I'm just doing this really sloppy, but you get the idea. And I've done several paintings like this. This is a lot of fun. It creates a lot of depth too. And then these shapes in the background, because they're nondescript and they've got blurry edges, they fade into the background. And you can create some really nice landscapes like this. So the next mistake that I want to talk about in watercolor painting is starting with details way too soon. So this is just a general kind of rule about art, and it's extremely helpful. It doesn't matter if you're sketching, if you're painting in any other medium. The idea is pretty much the same, is that you don't work on details until the very, very end. And we think that the details that we add really make the painting, or they're the fun part. But if you go in too soon with details, it can really kind of muddy up a painting and you lose a little bit of the freshness. So, um, if I were to paint, and I'm just going to grab some paint here, and paint a mushroom, and I'm just going to pull this down and make like a little stem. Now, if I start going in here, I could go in here and start adding details, but I feel like now that I have the large shape in, if I start adding details, I have forgotten about any sort of shadows that are in here, any sort of color variation. And I don't have a lot of form yet. So you want to concentrate on those things first. Start with your larger shape and get that down. And then you want to add in any areas that are darker. So let's say the underneath here. So I want to get these things in. And maybe I want to create some texture as well before I add any details in. And I'm doing this really quick. Um, wasn't really my intention to paint a mushroom, but we're gonna paint one. And details are really fun, obviously. But like I said, I think it can muddy up a painting if you go in too soon with details. And you want to make sure that you have the form in there and your shadows. Um, and then I'm going to hit this with the dryer really quick. And then we can add in some details. So I might go in with some um, paint with not a lot of water in it and a small brush. And I can add in some little dots so it looks like texture. And I want to add some down here. And I definitely want to add in, maybe the indication of some of the gills that are underneath. So something like that. And I can even add in a couple little blades of grass here. Now, it wouldn't have made a lot of sense for me to to go in and add all of those dots and stuff on top of the mushroom until I had the form already set. So we always work from big to small. Small being the details. And it's the same thing with sketching. So when you sketch something, let's say I'm going to sketch an animal, I start off with the large general shape and then I start concentrating on my values. And then once I have my values set and I have the form, then I can go in and start adding maybe some fur details. I can detail the face. And another point to make also is that if you start with the details too soon, there is the possibility of losing your focal point. So when you save the details for last, you can really hone in on where you want your viewer to look by adding in details in a specific part, like let's say an animal's face or their eyes. And that's where the attention goes, is to the more detailed part of the painting. But if everything is detailed, then the viewer really doesn't know where to look. So kind of keep those things in mind too. So the last thing that I want to talk about, and it's not really a mistake, but I think that a lot of people, and I don't know, I don't have an exercise for this, but I think people expect perfection way too soon. You have to do the painting in order to get better. And I've said in one of my past videos that practice makes perfect, but I don't believe there is perfect. But the joy is in the practicing, and the joy is in the painting and the creating. It's not, I mean, to have a nice painting at the end of it, yes. But I mean, we do this because we love to paint and we love to create. And I hope that you're kind of figuring this out along the way too. That's where the happiness is when it comes to sitting down to create. It's the actual process of it. um, and the finished product is just kind of like the cherry on top. So um, don't um, don't expect things to be, perfect. We all make mistakes. I make plenty of mistakes, and we just have to learn to work with them and apply them, in different ways that will basically benefit our painting. And it's all part of the process, and your brush is actually going to teach you a lot more than I can. So my suggestion is just to get your brushes out and start painting. And if you just want to make some big messes on your paper, like these puddles, and try some of these things out, um, and experiment, that is probably the best way, I think. um, I would say make sure that you've got halfway decent paper. If you can't, there's plenty of paper on the market, especially on Amazon, and you can find 100% cotton paper, which will make your life a lot easier. If you have better quality paper, buy what you can afford. And I think that's about it for this week. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. I'm always checking them. And thanks for being here. I hope this helped. And I will see you next week. Take care.